Welcome everyone to the webinar. I'll just check people can hear me. Is that working well, Fernando? Great. Welcome everyone to the webinar, Rethinking Support, What's Needed to Sustain Social Protection, Climate Action and Gender Equality Amid ODA Cuts. It has been organised by socialprotection.org as part of our 10th anniversary celebrations. Happy birthday, socialprotection.org. And today, in addition to hearing from our fantastic lineup of experts, we would also love to open the floor to you, the social protection community, for comments and reflection. So after our speakers have gone through their presentations, we'll have some time for discussion. Before we begin, I'd like to take the opportunity to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people as traditional custodians of the land I'm joining from, and elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge and welcome other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining today, and to extend that welcome to all of you with traditional connections to the lands you're joining from. As part of our 10th anniversary, the team is launching the annual satisfaction survey. We really welcome contributions from the community to help keep the platform relevant. And this year there's also a special questionnaire for policymakers. So if there are any policymakers in the audience, please, we would really appreciate your response. And a note that, of course, you're invited to share it within your networks. The link is available in the chat and also on the QR code on the slide. My name is Jo Sharp. I'm the host of the Social Protection podcast on the socialprotection.org platform, and I'll be your moderator today. A few quick notes, and we do have some housekeeping to get through before we get to the good stuff. Please consider renaming yourself with your name and your organisation on the screen so that we can see who you are. You can do this by clicking the 3 dots next to your name and selecting rename. It would be great to see some of you, and just so our speakers perhaps don't feel like they're speaking into the void. So do feel free to turn on your camera if you're comfortable with that. Just remember to keep your mic muted unless you're speaking. You can turn on automatic captions by clicking the CC button at the bottom of your screen. If you're like me, I had to click the triple dots there and click more before I got that option. And finally, this session is being recorded and will be published online so that others can watch it later. So as socialprotection.org marks its 10th anniversary this year, we take this opportunity not only to celebrate a decade of strengthening inclusive dialogue, collaboration and knowledge exchange, but also to pause and reflect and consider the road ahead. Despite social protection having established itself as a key enabler for sustainable development goals, contributor to gender equality and source of resilience in the face of crisis, we also face a period of uncertainty. Our discussion today asks how we can sustain support for social protection, climate action and gender equality at a moment when official development assistance is under real strain. The OECD projects that ODA will decline in real terms this year, the first such fall in several years, as donors face fiscal tightening, shifting domestic priorities. Multilateral organisations, often the main drivers of gender, climate and social protection programs and agendas, are expected to experience some of the sharpest reductions. We're likely to see less aid going to the poorest countries, less funding for gender equality and greater pressure on climate finance, especially for adaptation and resilience. And of course, we all know that the human cost of this is real. We know that women and girls are often the first to feel the effects of funding cuts through lost education opportunities, reduced access to healthcare, weaker protection from violence. And if social protection systems don't expand, as we all hope they will, if they are stalled or scaled back, then the poorest and most climate vulnerable households are left without a safety net. And all of this is happening in a year that has also seen a renewed push for financing and a lot of discussion through fora like the 4th International Finance for Development, the upcoming World Summit on Social Development, of course, COP30, and of course, the SDG Horizon 2030 is rapidly coming into view with targets off track for achievement. So today's conversation asks, how do we rethink support, not just to manage cuts, but to build systems that are fairer, more resilient and politically grounded? Our discussion will explore, as we have up on the screen there, the current landscape of aid cuts, the risks of deprioritising gender and climate within this changing landscape, the importance of shifting away from the fragmented supply-led systems of the current order towards models driven by civil society demand and grounded in national politics. And of course, how countries can build differently for the future. There are a lot of ways to participate in today's session, and we really hope that you will. If you'd like to right now, you could drop your name, organisation, and where you're joining from today in the chat. If you feel like it, you can give us a sentence on what it's like where you are. I'm here in beautiful Canberra, where the sun is still shining, but the pollen is on the air. So we're sneezing up a storm in my household today. You're also welcome to pose questions and make comments in the chat at any time, or wait until the discussion segment and we'll give you the opportunity to raise your hand, come off mic and speak if you'd like to. And if for any reason you did want to make a comment or ask a question anonymously, there are instructions for how to do that on the screen just there, and we'll also put that in the chat. So just to warm you up and get you all thinking, we have 3 questions we'd like to put to you all now in a poll. These are multiple choice questions, nice and easy. So get your mouses ready. The first question is, so it's just the poll will pop up and you should just be able to click your selection when it does. The first question is this one: how concerned are you about the impact of current ODA cuts on social protection systems in your country or region? Waiting to see the results. Are they going to come up, Fernanda? Is that what I'm expecting? Thanks. Interesting. So at least half of our audience is extremely concerned, with most of you somewhat concerned, and it looks like one or two people there perhaps not very concerned or who need more information. Certainly, I think this webinar will supply some of that information, but hopefully by the end of it, we also have a sense of the way forward. The next question, wait till it comes up. What's most needed to decolonise social protection approaches? Just while we're waiting, thank you to those of you who've introduced yourself in the chat. Fantastic to see all of you joining from all over the world. Interesting. So, I mean, a lot of us probably chose all of the above. Oh, sorry. No, I do. I am online. There you go. Beg your pardon. All of the above, but followed by greater national policy leadership, which I think is an interesting, in the context of this conversation. Shifting local funding to, power to local actors, stronger role for civil society, and then ending one size fits all. So it would be great to hear from you all in the discussion section, because we'll have one of the questions we'll ask you then is, how do we think about taking this forward and building social protections systems in the current environment? So please do feel free to chime in with some additional thoughts that have motivated those answers. Let's come to the final question, which is, in your experience, who currently has the most influence over social protection priorities? Thank you. So that's national governments followed closely by donors and international actors. An interesting finding, as we say, as we will discuss in this webinar, of course, with donors and international actors, increasingly having and less funding in different institutional structures and potentially fewer staff. So it will be interesting to see how that sort of shifts over time. And thank you for the comment about that being, I've just seen in the chat about that being really interesting. Again, you're welcome to comment on that further in the discussion session when it comes up. So we're getting to the good part now. We have a fantastic lineup of speakers today. Valentina Barca is an independent social protection expert, no stranger to those of you. I think this whole panel will be well known to many people on this call. Valentina will be speaking on the overall landscape of ODA cuts and international restructuring. Dr. Anna McCord is STAAR Climate Lead and ODI Senior Research Associate. She'll be speaking on the role of ODA in supporting social protection responses to the pandemic and climate-induced shocks and stresses and the implications of those ODA cuts. We have Rebecca Holmes, STAAR Consultant and Senior Research Associate at ODI, speaking on the impacts of ODA cuts on gender responsive and inclusive social protection. Simon Levine, who is Senior Research Fellow at the Global Risks and Resilience Program at ODI Global, will act as a discussant. We also had planned to have Sophia Swithin with us as a discussant, but unfortunately she wasn't able to join. So our thoughts are with her and her family today. And then, as I keep saying, we would love to hear from you. When we convened, we looked around at each other and noticed something pretty glaringly obvious, which is that we are a panel of Northern or European or international experts. The panel was composed of independent experts who aren't directly employed by donors, multilateral institutions or governments. So we're looking forward to some frank and open commentary. But we all recognise the need for greater diversity and more diverse views in this conversation. So again, when we later have 25, 30 minutes for a Q&A and discussion session, we would love to hear from you, just to get you thinking. Some of the questions we have for this group are what you're seeing on the ground in terms of how ODA cuts are affecting social protection, commitments to gender equality or climate action, areas in your country, whether you're seeing areas where you are, where support has been pulled back in ways that are especially concerning, or perhaps whether you see cause for optimism. What would it look like to truly build differently in your country or region or any other burning issues? And then, of course, if in lieu of a comment, you have a question for the panel, please do put all of that in the chat as we go along, or raise your hand when we get to that section. And again, if you prefer to make comments or ask questions anonymously, that link is again in the chat. Without further preamble, I'll pass to you, Valentina.
Amazing, thanks. Can everyone see my screen? Great. Okay, so what I've been asked to do is to update a webinar which we did a few months ago when we just had news of what was happening with the US aid cuts. And thankfully, we have more information now from OECD, for example, kind of a new paper by them. But I would invite you to go and take a look at the two old blogs that we already did on this topic, because they condense also a lot of the insights from that previous webinar, which also came from many of you. What I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be looking at the three main channels of impact, and obviously the main one being financing. Then I'll be looking at sort of the institutional implications and some of the deplatforming of certain topics. So let's jump into the financing, what has been happening, and how have different countries and sectors been impacted. Now, if we look at the overall trend, and I'm very much citing this policy brief by OECD 2025, I hope that will be popped into the chat and you can find a lot more detail there, is we see a 9 to 17% drop in official development assistance in 2025. And this comes on top of a 9% drop in 2024, and with the outlook beyond 2025 remaining highly uncertain. This is driven by announced cuts in four major providers of ODA, France, Germany, United Kingdom, United States, of course, which we've already been discussing. But there's 11 total to date amongst the ODA donors that have announced cuts, Austria, Belgium, Finland, Netherlands, New Zealand, Sweden, Switzerland being others in that list. And we see a negative forecast coming from the EU's kind of multi-annual financial framework discussions for 2028, 2034. Now, what's depressing here is that the projected trends are worse for least developed countries. So we're looking at a downfall of 13 to 25%, and for sub-Saharan Africa, 16 to 28%. And this is because these are more highly exposed than other parts of the world. So what the chart on the left is showing you, up at the top, we have sub-Saharan Africa. Below, we have LDCs. And this grayish, whatever color this is, bluish color, is the amount of ODA coming from the 11 providers that are cutting ODA vis-a-vis other DAC countries. And let's remember that non-DAC countries wouldn't really kind of account for much. And this is both looking at bilateral and imputed multilateral ODA. So it's kind of basically looking at almost all of the pie. Is there any good news? I'll be using these green boxes to try and look at good news in the background. We do see planned increases in ODA by Ireland, Korea, and Spain. We see some other countries that are wanting to maintain existing high levels of ODA, but these are not big donors. They're quite small economies, so the proportion to GNI, even though it's a good proportion, isn't kind of doing much for international development. Now, are any countries in particular being affected? Obviously, the countries that we're relying the most on ODA are the most affected. We see, for example, that half of the top four combined net bilateral aid to least developed countries between 2014 and 2023 was going to just 7 countries. These are the ones that you see on the left of my screen. I'm showing them now with a pointer. There's many different ways we can be looking at this. If you want detail, do look at the OECD publication, do look at some of these other publications. I liked this IRC one because it's looking at intersecting levels of exposure and vulnerability of different countries, but it's not updated. For example, it's looking at exposure to US aid cuts, not the comprehensive aid cuts. But I think it would be a good idea for us all to be kind of updating similar types of projections to see which countries are being most affected and how our countries are being affected. There's a lot of data on this out there. Any sectors in particular being affected? Once again, the source is the OECD brief. The projected declines are at around 21 to 36% for humanitarian aid, similar percentages for government and civil society type programs. Health is very toughly affected because US was such a big donor, between 14 and 29%, and education between 18 and 22%. Now, as often happens, for example, the OECD brief doesn't even mention social protection, and that's why we need to be digging a bit further if we want to be looking at it. But before I look at social protection specifically, I just wanted to reflect on the role of humanitarian aid and the ripple effects on us as a sector. We could be doing the same for health education, but let's zone into humanitarian. Now, what's been happening, and I think all of you have been following, is kind of what we're now referring to as the humanitarian reset. This kind of huge, drastic level of cut to the sector is unprecedented. And we've seen an update to the Global Humanitarian Overview 2025, which is called The Cruel Maths of Aid Cuts, which says it all. What's been happening is a hyper prioritization of the previous appeal with a focus on people and places that needed the most. And this means scaled back humanitarian operations in a set of countries. You can see them listed here on the screen. A prioritization of life-saving activities. And what this means, even in discussions with humanitarian actors very often, is they're saying we need to be focusing on saving lives. So anything about linking with social protection and systems building doesn't really is not top priority anymore. And in general, the fact this hyper-prioritized appeal and pulling back from certain countries and also reducing the number of people supported, even in the countries where the humanitarians are staying, has knock-on effects, domino effects, in terms of increased caseloads that are unprotected and likely future increases in poverty vulnerability due to all of that. So the knock-on effects for the social protection sector are big. And I just wanted to show you this map. This is the map of the countries where humanitarian operations will be continuing of that hyper-prioritized list. And while some humanitarians push back saying these are not countries where you typically have social protection systems, I think we can all agree that most of them are countries where we do have, maybe nascent, maybe not that strong, but we do have social protection systems that we could be working alongside and through. So we need to be kind of having that conversation kind of very openly, debunking some of those myths. What about direct funding to social protection? We know that ODA to social protection was never that high. Even in this COVID peak around 2020, 2021, we were only hitting about the 3% mark, and that's been going down and is kind of likely to continue going down into the future. And we currently know that, yes, social protection is relatively less impacted compared to those other sectors. The US was not a top direct social protection donor. We said this in the last webinar. It was the 9th largest donor to the sector, providing just 1% of the total going to the sector. This is thanks to analysis by Sophia Swithern, compared to 54% from the World Bank. And this goes up to 73% in countries experiencing protracted crises. So very big dependency on one actor. And we know that in the last round of pledges, the US has only cut 1/5 of its IDA pledge, going down to 3.2 billion. And it's kind of in its outward expressions, it hasn't changed its central commitment to increasing social protection coverage by 500 million by 2030. Though we have seen some changes in language in terms of what we're focusing on, and that's sort of something we need to be careful of going forward. Obviously, there's also other donors which are kind of relatively big donors to social protection, Germany, EU, UK, but we know that these are also donors that are cutting. So yes, we're relatively less impacted, but in no shape or form are we safe. I've said I've got some green good news. We've had the financing working group of USP 2030, our UN rapporteur for poverty and human rights, which have been putting a lot of pressure at the Sevilla conference. So we've got in the commitment, we have a clear embedding of commitment to social protection, with social protection systems seen as key to global efforts to combating inequalities. We've got specific text in that commitment which speaks to the will to provide support to developing countries that aim to increase their social protection coverage, pressure on the IMF to be supporting, etc. But even in the words of the rapporteur on human rights, there's still questions on where this investment could be coming from. Still very useful push for a global fund for social protection, but still question marks around how that would be financed. Great discussions on sort of new tools, debt for social protection swaps, tax coordination, etc. But we need to also be kind of thinking beyond this. I'd like to also showcase the fact that kind of another piece of good news is that the high-level panel on social protection in fragile and conflict-affected settings has collected a huge amount of recent research coming from research institutions such as BASIC and STAAR, but also kind of many of you. We had almost 80 submissions to the public inquiry. We're coming out with an outcome document, which is really showcasing that social protection not only can be done in fragile and conflict-affected settings, it is being done kind of quite frequently and with really important outcomes. And obviously the role of the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty is something we need to be kind of believing in and pushing. Now, coming to the second channel, the institutional restructuring, the problem here is significant reliance by many of our kind of multilateral agencies on those 11 countries that have been cutting ODA. So here you can see an 87% reliance from the World Food Programme, 83% reliance from UNHCR, 74% OCHA, 69% UNICEF. These are all actors that play a massive role in our sector. And what that has translated into, you've all been watching this, and it's been incredibly depressing, is cuts in staffing, quite drastic cuts in staffing. You can see some of the figures here on the screen, 25 to 30% for WFP, 30 to 50% for UNHCR, around 20% for UNICEF, but that's looking like it could be getting worse, and 20% for OCHA. Now, it's obviously it's not about just the staff cuts, it's also about how organizations are being reorganized. So take UNICEF. I've a kind of a good colleague who said that the way that UNICEF is being reorganized is addressing a problem that wasn't there. I mean, this could have been an opportunity to cut organizations down to what they were pre-2012. We have seen a massive inflation in the number of staff for some of these organizations, but we could have been doing this strategically, thinking about what it is we're trying to achieve, but that's not what's been happening. And in fact, depressingly, what we're seeing, and I see it in my own work, is I keep losing the partners, the counterparts that I'm working with against kind of important outcomes. And from one day to the next, that these staff are gone, and they're being asked to reapply for roles that kind of don't really fit their expertise. The green in the background is just reminding us that we still have an incredible number of people working in country that are not from these international organizations. So social protection is resilient because of the people working at country level. Obviously, the internationals play a role, these organizations play a big role, but kind of we've got a lot that we can hook on to. Obviously, there's the topics being deplatformed, and my colleagues Anna and Rebecca will be talking about this more. We've had big attacks on climate change, on kind of gender and inclusion. We've had big attacks on migration and kind of supporting people who have been displaced. And I don't know if you haven't read the statements to the WFP Executive Board, to FAO, to UNICEF, I would go and read these, for example, from the US, because they give a sense of what's coming. But for each of these topics, I'll just say it for climate change, but this is valid for each of these topics. We as a sector have really come to a point in recent years, just these last 2-3 years, we've seen a shift in gear in terms of really understanding our role vis-a-vis some of these topics, how we could be working better and differently vis-a-vis these topics. The work by the USP 2030 SPEAC-B group on, for example, integrating social protection and national determined contributions has kind of been a big step change in how we can be engaging in climate discussions. We've seen shifts where even the Green Climate Fund has started co-publishing on social protection and inclusive climate action, and sort of doing more research on these topics, really understanding the implications. And in fact, we've even got indicators for measuring progress towards adaptation outcomes, which will be negotiated at COP30, which speak to the role of social protection. This is a massive hook, a massive win. And even the advisory opinion at the ICJ on the obligations of states in respect of climate change has hooks for social protection that we need to be using. So I won't be doing this for every topic, but kind of let's really celebrate kind of what we've achieved so far, also thanks to socialprotection.org. And I'll hand it over from here for the other speakers, having set this slightly depressing scene.
Thank you, Valentina. And despite it being a slightly depressing scene, as you said there were those bright sparks and green boxes. I have been really interested to follow that story you were telling about the really strong push and advocacy through the severe commitment to see social protection remain prominent. I was speaking with Shara Razavi and Ifat Sharif from the ILO and the World Bank just the other day, actually, in an episode of the podcast, which is about to come out now, where Shara is talking about, the sort of step-by-step process when they realized that social protection was not mentioned at all in the draft document, and how that was turned around through the advocacy of these multilateral institutions and, of course, the member states that form part of USP 2030. So it is really interesting to see that continued advocacy at the international level, even, as you say, as people are disappearing out of some of those organizations. And I really appreciated that comment as well, Valentina, about social protection being resilient because of the people working at country level. And I guess my reflection is to feel perhaps fortunate that the sector is less reliant on some of those big donors, as you mentioned, although, of course, as you said, doesn't mean it's safe, to use your words. Thank you for we'll come now to Dr. Anna McCord, who's going to speak on the climate dimensions and some of that really exciting emerging work and really concrete linking between social protection and climate that Vale also hinted at right at the end of that presentation. Please go ahead, Anna.
Thank you very much. Can you see the slides?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay.
Not yet, but we'll get there.
I have a challenge. I have them up. It's not working. Okay.
That's looking good. And we've just got your calendar. That's perfect.
Great, lovely. Thank you, Jo, and thank you, Vale, for that rather depressing introduction, but extremely useful for setting the scene. And thank you to socialprotection.org for everything they have done to support the kind of discussions and the learning. And thank you for creating this platform. Because I think at 10 years on, socialprotection.org has been going for 10 years. And I think what I've been invited to do is look at some of the challenges emerging. But I'd like to start by going back and looking back at what we've achieved over the last 10 years. So I'm going to briefly look at key events and ideas to put up a timeline, because I think it's very useful to look at where we are in relation to where we've come from and how this discussion today fits into some amazing changes that have been happening over the last decade. Then I'll say a few words about achievements and lessons. And I wanted to leave you with some challenges, because I think the most important thing for us as a community is to recognize that this really is a point of challenge. And so I've put up some questions, which I hope we'll be able to discuss together in the remainder of the session. So I just wanted to start by setting the scene in a way, because so much has changed over the last 10 years. It was only a couple of years before SP.org was founded in 2015 that actually the social protection floor recommendation came through from the ILO. And that's so much part of our context now that we forget that was actually a very recent initiative. And then similarly, in the early 2010s, we had these real initiatives to try and improve donor coordination, because prior to this, donor coordination was a really major issue. And so the creation of the SPIAC-B, Social Protection Interagency Board, to bring together the main institutional players was, I think, also a key kind of framing point for where we are today. And then, of course, we have the SDGs in 2015, which really changed the role of social protection, because it brought it directly into the international discussion through the indicator 1.3. And then we have the Global Partnership for Universal Social Protection, an effort for the bank and ILO to collaborate together to really push the realization of the NDGs. And of course, the Global Accelerator in 2021, the ILO's efforts to really enhance the social protection discourse. And of course, the Global Alliance, sorry, I don't have that in there, in 2024. And then the recent 2 billion challenge from the World Bank, which really sort of highlights we've achieved a lot, but we still need to look at incorporating these groups that are missing and a strategy to bring them in. So actually, that really represents quite significant institutional changes in terms of social protection over the last decade. And similarly, there have been major developments in the disaster and humanitarian side. Just pulling out some of the key events there. The Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction was only introduced in 2015. So that was the point at which there was this rethinking of the whole relationship between DRR and the broader development process. And of course, then we had the Grand Bargain in 2016, which actually explicitly set out the need to integrate social protection and humanitarian responses, and looking at how there could be an agenda around developing more efficiencies there. And that's particularly interesting for us, I think, this question, because we heard from Vale how there have been these significant cuts in humanitarian financing. So as we have this closer integration between social protection and humanitarian actions, what do those humanitarian cuts mean for us in the social protection sector? And then, of course, we've got the current sort of ongoing humanitarian reset in the UN, which is part of the broader restructuring UN 80 process, looking at how the institutions themselves will change. And we heard from Vale about the changes in financing to the different humanitarian agencies, but actually we're looking at a significant restructuring as well, and possibly a different kind of institutional context for that work. And of course, that UN 80 discussion also includes wider questions about how the institutional framework might shift, as well as beyond the humanitarian frame. So I think that's a very relevant and interesting one for us. And then if we look at climate, I think this is where the change has been most dramatic for us as a sector. Again, the Paris Agreement on climate change is so seminal to much of our work, and that was just 10 years ago that was signed. And so since then, we've seen these major changes. We've had a development of a number of different financing instruments. The Green Climate Fund was actually 2010, but more recently, we've had the Global Shield, the V20 initiative, G20 initiative, which really looked at alternative financing instruments for responding to climate impacts, including through social protection. And of course, very recently, the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage. And there's a lot of interest in whether that might be another avenue for funding social protection responses to climate. And then, of course, we've had the development of the USP Working Group on Social Protection and Climate Change, which has been important, I think, for us in our community in looking at how we social protection actors engage with the whole debate. And of course, the inclusion of social protection explicitly as an instrument to address climate challenges in COP28 was, I think, probably the most important recent development for us, because that clearly articulated internationally the fact that there was a role for social protection to play in addressing climate challenges. So there's been a huge amount happening internationally in terms of the events, the architecture which frame our work. And then on top of that, we've had some other things. We've had, of course, COVID, which officially, I didn't know this, it officially ran from 2020 to 23. The WHO actually closed the emergency announcement in 2023, which of course had a huge impact on our work, and we'll discuss that more. Then we've also had these major ODA and geopolitical shifts, which Vale was talking about earlier. And then finally, I think we've really seen the impact of climate change. They've started to become very real, particularly in small island states, in areas affected by extreme weather events, by droughts. I mean, we've seen a major acceleration of climate-related events, which has really, again, changed the context for our work. So, over this time, we've seen a number of key ideas emerge, which I think have really framed our work, and really come to the fore over this period. I mean, I've put these as sort of in historically. One was this idea of adaptive social protection, which is actually trying to link social protection with climate, with disaster risk reduction and livelihoods. And that was first mooted almost 20 years ago by the IDS, but it's become very much popularized by the World Bank. And now that is one of the key themes running through our work, I think. And then this idea of shock responsive social protection, which grew out of some work financed by FCDO originally in about 2012, carried out by OPM and ODI, and has really come to perhaps dominate, and we'll come back to this, our thinking in relation to social protection and climate, and perhaps social protection generally. And I think many of us will be familiar with this language of vertical, horizontal design tweaks. That's really sort of entered the lexicon of how you use social protection to respond to climate. And that came out in a publication in 2018. So I think actually these couple of ideas have really played a major role in shaping what we do. Then we've also seen the emergence of anticipatory social protection, linking social protection to disaster response through early warning systems, looking at how you deliver resources in advance of shocks and crises. And then, of course, we've seen some seminal work by the ILO looking really at how social protection has a role to play in the whole question of the just transition. So that's the transitioning of economies to be less carbon intensive, phasing out of polluting industries, introducing carbon pricing. And the ILO really sort of put that on the table as a question. How does social protection play a role in protecting the poor in that context? And I think the other major strand of interesting thinking is this one about social protection across the humanitarian development nexus. And the EC did some important work in that area. In 2019, published a report on that then, really looking at how the humanitarian cash sector and the social protection sectors could come together to look at how humanitarian interventions could be used to contribute much more to systems building, how they could be more nationally owned, and what kind of linkages and efficiencies there might be there. Obviously, something that becomes much more important as we look at the reduction of external ODA financing. And I think that perhaps the final issue is to recognise is that social protection, climate has really become more central to the whole social protection debate. And I think the Red Cross did some really important work in 2020, putting some of these issues onto the agenda, raising questions, challenging us as a sector to think about how we could be responding to climate challenges. And I've got links to all of these, which will be in the version of the PowerPoint, which is shared. There were too many to put up. But if people are interested in looking at any of these, I think really critical documents which kind of set out the issues in these different areas, I'd be very happy to share them. And the upshot of all of this was, I think that over the last 10 years, we've seen a shift, an expanding of the concept of social protection. And traditionally, it's been very much looking at income protection, life cycle risks. But actually, we've been looking more over the last 10 years as a community at social protection as a broader kind of risk management tool that incorporates disasters, shocks, and other kinds of issues, which perhaps previously have been more addressed in the humanitarian sector. So if you were to sort of sum up how social protection has changed, I think it's exploring this idea of social protection as a risk management tool. So I think it's really important. This would be a green slide if this were Vale. Looking at what we have achieved over the last decade, we have seen an extension of provision. And I think that's really important to acknowledge. And coverage has increased from about 40% of the population covered by at least one instrument to 50% globally. So that's the headline, which is to be celebrated. But actually, in low-income countries, the increase has been less than 10% increase in coverage. Coverage is still less than 10% in low-income countries. And since 2015, it's increased from about 7.7% coverage to 9.7% coverage. So actually, in low-income countries, we're still looking at very low levels of provision. Similarly, I think Southern Asia, we're only looking at 35% coverage. And in Sub-Saharan Africa, we're still looking at 15% coverage. So I think we can celebrate the growth of coverage, but really it's still extremely constrained in poorer contexts. But going back to the green, we've seen a significant growth in national policies, national social protection policies and strategies. There's far more of these than there were 10 years ago. We've also seen greater integration of social protection into law. And we have seen a successful increase in the integration of social protection and DRR humanitarian interventions. That's been a very dynamic area, and we have seen developments there. And we've also seen a significant rise in investment in shock responsive and adaptive social protection. That's been something which has been very much promoted by the donor community with great enthusiasm, and there's been a lot of innovation in those areas. And I think it's fair to say that we've also seen the emergence of a role for social protection in climate response, which extends beyond shock responsive social protection. It was very much limited to this initially, but I think the inclusion of social protection in the COP28 document, and also importantly in many countries' NDCs, shows that actually there's a role for social protection which goes beyond just shock response. So I think we're seeing a shift and a more developed, more sophisticated expression of what social protection is in relation to climate change. So those are really significant achievements. And I think we learned some really important lessons in COVID. COVID really demonstrated how you can use social protection systems for large-scale mass responses, covariate shock responses. And I think there'd been a lot of discussion about this previously, a lot of theoretical discussion, a lot of smaller pilot projects, but COVID really illustrated that social protection could be used for these mass responses. And interestingly, these responses were based on both existing systems and really radical innovations, which were completely outside existing responses in some contexts. For example, what we saw just to give you an example, in Sri Lanka, you saw a response which used the national existing system and added to it. It was a vertical expansion initially, and then a horizontal expansion as the program was extended to additional beneficiaries. In Togo, you saw a completely new program, which was introduced very rapidly and was rolled out to new populations who hadn't previously been served by social protection. And this was very, very much based on technology, on the use of digital IDs, on the use of digital registration. And so I think what we've seen is that there was this real burst, this flowering of innovation, and it showed that actually some countries could even leapfrog the traditional system, the traditional approach of building up a system. They could actually come straight in with a very sophisticated, high-tech kind of response. And I mean, I think it's astonishing. This program in Togo that I mentioned, it actually managed to cover 35% of urban adults in the areas where it was implemented. A state of emergency was announced on the 2nd of April. An emergency cash transfer was announced on the 8th of April, and by the 9th, payments were initiated, which is quite amazing. Even in Sri Lanka, there was this rapid rollout of the COVID response. Emergency nationwide curfew was announced on the 20th of March, and by the middle of April, they were actually distributing payments. So I think what we saw was that countries were recognizing the value of social protection systems and that they could use them to deliver an urgent response. And these were both driven, many were driven by national country programs independently of the donor community, and others were more supported externally. So there were a couple of interesting things which I think are relevant for us to learn out of the COVID experience. What came out very, very strongly was the critical importance of core systems. And perhaps the most important were having some kind of national identification system, or some way that different registries could be integrated with each other so that you had a full population record in order to deliver responses. And this is a really interesting insight, because there's been so much focus on social registries for particular groups. But actually, if we're looking into the future, we need to be accommodating new groups, new populations who aren't traditionally supported, then it becomes critical to have some kind of national ID, either a national registry or some way that the different registries can come together so that they can speak to each other. The other critical thing was having operational systems which could enable delivery. So a couple of other just general points on COVID, and then I probably need to move ahead. Jo, am I running out of time?
Anna, I'm sorry to give you a time check. You are just past your 15 minutes. So
I'm past my 15 minutes.
yeah,
Well, I'm sorry.
I know, but I know we're all listening raptly. So please do. Apologies for having to give you a time check, but
if
I'll just to let you know, and I'll let you wrap up.
No,
Thank
that's
you.
great. If I can just have two minutes, if that's all right.
Of course.
Challenges. This is the important bit. The challenges for us. I have some questions for the group. SRSP. Is the donor focused on building shock responsive systems, shock responsive programs, really at the expense of building core social protection systems and the extension of basic provision? Is there a risk of diverting resources to project-based initiatives, pilots with limited scale, time and duration, rather than large-scale systems? And have development partners lost the focus on supporting basic systems development? I'm just going to throw these questions out, Joe. I won't go into them. I'll just put them out to the group. In terms of climate, we have significant aspirations, but how realistic are they given the realities of coverage, less than 10% coverage in the most climate affected countries, and also the very low level of many transfers? Are interventions too focused on natural disasters and extreme weather events rather than slow onset events and climate impacts on human and ecological systems? A report came out yesterday. It's clear we're already reaching tipping points. We're going to breach 1.5, and there are going to be major impacts on ecological and human systems. But do we recognize this yet in the sector? What are the implications of the aid cuts for the sustainability and achievements that we've made over the last 10 years in aid-reliant contexts? Because does the programming that we've had, the social protection programming, actually reflect national priorities, or does it more reflect donor preferences? So what does that mean? If we withdraw the ODA financing, what does that mean for the shape of social protection systems that will emerge? And essentially, that's a question of decolonizing development. How do we make sure that social protection is actually what is wanted and needed by governments? So we really need to engage with this question of decolonizing development. We haven't yet addressed that in our sector. And very finally, what we're facing is a moment of massive geopolitical, socioeconomic, and climatic change. So really, we need to be rethinking our social protection policies, our programming, and the strategies that we use to intervene in a profoundly changing context. We've got plenty to learn from. We've got the institutional setup, but the situation is very different. So I just leave you with the question, what is the most constructive future role for us in terms of supporting government's work in the sector? Thank you, and apologies for overrunning.
Well, no, thank you, Anna, and I'm sorry to wrap you up. This, as you were saying, is such a rapidly recent and rapid sort of real upswing in interest and understanding of the relevance of social protection to climate change. I think we can trace it very much, as you said, just into the last few years. I will move straight on to our next speaker, but perhaps a quick shout out if you're interested in social protection in the NDCs. I had a wonderful guest from Cambodia on the podcast a couple of months ago talking specifically about how social protection had been integrated as a sector into Cambodia's updated NDC, and of course what that potentially means for the critical issue of accessing climate financing as well. Rebecca, please, over to you.
Great, thank you. And thank you for the invite to come and speak today. Really going to be looking at the effects of ODA cuts and sort of more generally kind of the crisis that we find ourselves in at the moment. Focusing in on the gender responsive and inclusive social protection and thinking through what those implications are. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I'm going to start with the positives and start with the progress, but spoiler alert, it doesn't really end so positively, but we also do have choices and chances to turn that around. But I think, again, like Anna has mentioned and as Vali has also highlighted as well, that we have to recognise that important progress has been made. And when we look at the issues of gender equality and inclusion, we need to recognise that over the last 10, 20, 30 years as a result of investment, as a result of government and civil society policy, as a result of advocacy and all the work that happens on the ground, there's been really significant results in terms of increasing life expectancy, well-being and health for girls, closing gender gaps, particularly in primary education between boys and girls. And also there's been significant gains in women's higher education, which has positive spillover effects in so many aspects of women and girls, but also broader men and boys and communities' lives. And we also have seen increased political representation and women's economic participation. We've also seen in the next slide that social protection has really played a positive role in contributing to these outcomes. So we've built significant evidence, especially over the last 10, 15 years, on the positive impact that social protection plays, especially when you look across the life course for women and girls. When social protection is delivered at scale, when it recognises and addresses the intersections between gender inequality, discrimination, factors such as disability and age, and that contribute to poverty, vulnerability crises, and climate change, that social protection through intentional policies, design and implementation can have really positive impacts on addressing these gendered and intersectional inequalities. We know that social protection can support access to schooling, especially helping girls transition to secondary school. We know that social protection supports women's economic participation and empowerment. It supports women and girls' use of healthcare, sexual and reproductive health services, and can help support reduce sexual violence and conflicts within the household. We also know that social protection can improve the agency of women and girls by enhancing their ability to make decisions, to have better control over their own decisions and own lives. Also, across the life course, non-contributory pensions in old age are a vital source of income and empowerment for older women, especially for those millions of informal women workers and those who have gaps in contributing to pensions because of time taken out because of care responsibilities. So that's the positive. Moving on to some of the challenges. So this is just a snapshot from the 2024 SDG Gender Index, which is a comprehensive global measure of gender equality. And this shows sort of how good where we are globally on gender equality, sort of measured by the SDG Gender Index. There is one small dark blue spot there, which shows that only one country is rated very good. And for those who are not so good at geography and spotting that, that is Switzerland. But most are poor or very poor, you can see from the colours. Whilst some countries are doing better on gender equality than others, what this also shows is that no country is on track to achieve gender equality by 2030. And worryingly, between 2019 and 2022, nearly 40% of countries, which is home to over 1 billion women and girls in 2022, stagnated or declined on gender equality. And this can also be seen in the next slide, which shows at the projected trends for achieving gender equality. And as you can see here, it doesn't look good. The light blue line carrying up like this is the target for 2030, which even if we were to achieve through fast progress, the dark purple line, we are way off. So based on current trends, the world won't achieve gender equality for nearly a century. And even that is optimistic, especially given the set of challenges that we're facing today, which is what I'm going to go on to now. So I think just recognising, as both Valentina and Anna have as well, that we are facing these challenges in ODA cuts, But the current crisis isn't just financial. We are looking and we are experiencing a context where we have the impacts of climate change, we have the implications and ramifications still from the COVID-19 pandemic, increasing conflicts, protracted crises, as well as more broadly in terms of social norms, gender norms and discrimination. We are in a time where we have concerted attacks to reduce rights by anti-equality movements and also shrinking civil space. So what does that mean for gender equality, and what does that mean for progress on gender and inclusion? In the next slide, we can just see that this has significant implications for example, support for women's, girls' health and education, especially sexual and reproductive health, and disrupting efforts sustaining girls' schooling. We can also see that these crisis and funding cuts reduce investment in inclusive services that particularly might support adolescents, people with disabilities, sexual minorities, and other people already facing multiple forms of discrimination. And we know from previous experiences that aid cuts, reduction in financing, both directly and indirectly, has significant impact on women's rights organisations and civil society organisations, especially with the broader sort of backlash that a lot of gender rights activists and inclusion activists are facing right now, putting civil society organisations under severe stress. We also know that cuts in humanitarian aid often hit protective services, mental health and psychosocial support. And really, the situation is that these budget cuts don't only pause the progress that we've been seeing, but actually really risk reversing the hard-fought gains that have been made in gender equality and inclusion. And this isn't only felt by women and girls and broader family and communities now, but for generations to come. So we know from sort of other crises contexts, from reducing or diverting funding towards the services that I mentioned above, that this can increase maternal mortality, risks girls completing school, as well as sort of the loss of productivity and the implications for that for women and girls in terms of their time spent on productive and income generating opportunities, increasing care responsibilities for women and girls, and reducing participation in the workforce. So now thinking, what are these implications for the social protection sector in particular? And I want to just highlight kind of 4 key ways in which reductions and the reductions in financing, but also the broader sort of socio-political context can have implications for gender responsive and inclusive social protection. And I'll just talk through each of these now, but just highlighting that this sort of exacerbates existing gaps and challenges in social protection from a gender and inclusion lens. The direct impacts of loss of income and support through social protection, which can disproportionately impact women and girls, deepening challenges for the social protection workforce, as well as the impacts on civil society. So if we turn to the existing, sort of exacerbating existing challenges, although in the beginning of the presentation I did focus on the highlights in terms of the progress that has been achieved and not reducing that in any way, but we know that there are existing challenges, that we don't routinely integrate gender and inclusion into the work of or into the policies and programs of social protection. So although there has been increased coverage, there are still gender gaps at the global level. For example, for working age populations and by comprehensive social security systems, there's still a 10% difference between men and women. We also know that there still remain gender inequalities and addressing those across the life course. So only 6%, for example, of women with newborns in sub-Saharan Africa receive a cash maternity benefit. Free maternity care is not universally available. And also globally, almost 2/3 of potential fathers live in countries with no entitlements to paternity leave. We also know that there are still limited attention and limited policies really tackling the structural inequalities that women and girls face. So a recent review of policies across 74 low and middle income countries found that structural inequalities, like women and girls' disproportionate responsibility for unpaid care work, for women's overrepresentation among informal workers, or women and girls' heightened exposure to gender-based violence, are rarely acknowledged in social protection policies. We also know that whilst there were real innovations and support through COVID-19, as Anna mentioned as well, that actually only less than 1 in 5 social protection measures implemented globally during the COVID-19 pandemic specifically addressed the increased vulnerability of women and girls, for example, supporting women in informal employment, mitigating the risks of violence, or confronting the unequal distribution of care work. And I'll pop some of the links from these papers into the chat after I've spoken. The second way is the second impact is the loss of income or support through social protection, which can disproportionately impact women and girls. So we know that households and the way that they cope in hardship, in times of crisis or in hardship, that coping strategies are rarely gender neutral. When household food is scarce, for example, women and girls' nutrition suffers, often at the time that they need it most in terms of during pregnancy, breastfeeding, or the specific nutritional needs that adolescent girls face. Women and girls often take on additional and disproportionate care responsibilities, affecting income opportunities and schooling. And when under stress, girls and boys are often pulled out of school. Girls face heightened risks of child marriage. There are often increases in gender-based violence, and often it is women's assets or income that is the first to go. Then in terms of the third sort of pathway or third sort of implication, thinking more about the sort of the systems level of social protection rather than the recipients. But it will deepen challenges in the social protection workforce. So the social protection workforce refers to sort of a wide range of professionals, paraprofessionals, but also volunteers who work in paid and unpaid positions to deliver social protection and associated services. Currently, already, the social service workforce is characterised by poor working conditions, low or in some cases no pay, a lack of employment protection and access to social protection. Many social protection programmes rely on volunteers to deliver their programmes at the community level, many of whom are women. And funding cuts, either directly or indirectly, impacts the working conditions of the social protection workforce, reducing salaries or recruitment, increasing the reliance on volunteers, eroding institutional support systems, which ultimately also reduces the reach and quality of social protection programmes. And moving on to the fourth impact, which is around the impact of funding cuts on civil society organisations' ability to not only deliver social protection, but also their longer term advocacy capacity. So recent research that the Share Trust has done through STAAR has really shed some valuable light on the role of local actors and women's rights organisations in particular in social protection. This research finds that local actors, including women's rights organisations, bring important contextual and community level understanding and connections to social protection design and implementation. But often this is not drawn on, that the local organisations and women's rights organisations are rather on the periphery of social protection design. They are restricted often to operational roles and rarely participate in sort of the more strategic decision-making aspects of social protection. Adequate and sustainable funding is one of the challenges that they face to be more involved in social protection, often only receiving piecemeal and sort of projectized funding to delivering specific aspects of social protection. And this lack of core funding undermines the ability of organisations to deliver social protection, but also to lead on gender responsive and inclusive social protection. So what are the implications and recommendations? I've set out a few here, but there are obviously there are more, and it'd be great to hear from you suggestions that you might have as well in terms of prioritising and focusing and integrating gender responsive and inclusive social protection. So I think the important overarching issue is that gender inclusion aren't add-ons to social protection. It's not a nice to have, rather they are absolutely essential, an integral part of the social protection system. And how can we support these integral parts of the system in the context of funding cuts and in the context of the challenges that we find ourselves in today? So first is ring fencing funding for gender and inclusion and focusing on improving gender and inclusion mainstreaming within social protection systems across policy, design and implementation. The second is really working hard together to coordinate and collaborate, bringing in gender and inclusion expertise to social protection, but also vice versa. Am I running out of time, Jo? Okay, I'm on my last 1 minute, if that's
right.
Okay.
Yeah, you're just past your time, but do
All right,
do wrap up. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so utilising existing structures, for example, the SPEAC-B working groups, the gender working group is just about to publish a set of principles that will be really useful for people, who are perhaps not gender and inclusion experts, but thinking, how do we make our work, the support that we do on social protection, more gender responsive? And so hopefully these will also be helpful. But also utilising and bringing in gender and inclusion aspects and team members in national social protection coordination mechanisms, for example, and joining the social protection, gender responsive social protection community of practice. There are lots of avenues in the ways that we can strengthen and share expertise and collaboration. The third area is supporting wider political environment for progress and ensuring that we don't regress on gender equality, on women's rights, on inclusion. And this really requires advocating for gender equality and inclusion and support for diversity at high level, whether this is through high level policy dialogues, high level events, but really keeping gender and inclusion issues visible and advocating collaboratively for the importance of gender and inclusion. The fourth area is focusing on providing flexible multi-year funding for women's rights organisations, supporting leadership opportunities for civil society in social protection, and then finally protecting data monitoring and valuation for gender and inclusion outcomes, really the importance and linking that to the high-level advocacy, providing the evidence base for why it is important and why it is not just a kind of good to have, like to have, but an integral part of the system. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. And again, apologies for needing to wrap you up. We have about 15 minutes left in the session. So Simon, we'll move swiftly to you for a series of very pithy comments. Welcome.
Thanks, I'm going to be quick. Thanks enormously to Vale and Rebecca for 3 presentations that were both highly informative and also very analytical, which is exactly what we would have expected from the 3 of you, those of us who know you well. Fortunately, I'm called the discussant and not a presenter, so I don't have to compete with that. What I am going to do, I've been asked to look at, well, what's the role of civil society? What's the national role? And what I'm going to do is try and spread a little bit of green so that we all leave slightly happier. Well, the takeaway from the presentations, Vale showed us that we can't rely on international funds. Yeah, that's fine. But there was plenty of green in her presentation around national capacities. And what I'm going to suggest is partly that the fact that we if we can't rely on international funds, we have to look at that as an opportunity and not just as a threat. Anna painted green all over her presentation in terms of the progress, and it really, really is important to recognise that. And there was a clue also as to why reducing international funds has to become an opportunity. In her presentation, she raised the issue on social protection being overly donor driven in its, and I think we saw that from the one size fits all, which an awful lot of people either ticked as the box or ticked as all of the above, including that one, and the the natural disaster focus, which means the focus on shocks and not on people. Rebecca also, lots and lots of green, huge progress on things like girls' education. That's really significant. And in saying that the crisis isn't just financial. So in other words, money isn't just a solution. And I want to pick up on one thing that she had on the slide, as I remember, which is that gender is not an add-on. And I think that is the key to the way we need to think about it. Why? Because it's not just that gender isn't an add-on, social protection isn't an add-on. But I think that to some extent, the way in which international assistance has been thinking about social protection has made it an add-on. Yeah. So we have society as it is, plus a cash transfer program. And that's what social protection is. Yeah. Because international aid almost inevitably has been treating social protection as a technical issue, technical and financial, because we don't want to get involved in the politics of societies that we don't really understand. And that means that we largely have reduced it to cash transfer programs, with, of course, the notable exception of ILO, who see it very, very differently. Yeah. And so we've kind of reduced it to a box, to a sector. And social protection is not a sector. Social protection has to be a way of thinking in every single sector. Social protection is about how a society chooses to protect the people who need protection. And if we think, for example, about, I think we see the sectorization of that political and social question in the way in which Anna was showing us about shock responsive social protection. A huge improvement, a huge advance. But to a large extent in the aid world, we're thinking about this as cash transfers that go up and down. Now, if we're actually thinking about how do we protect people in the event of shocks, it can't only be about a cash transfer. So, yeah, so let's not get too depressed. Lots and lots of progress. Not just in the expansion of coverage of cash transfer programming, of monetary payments, but also in a mindset about social protection. And there are also changes in the world in how people are thinking about citizenship. For example, a couple of countries in Africa experiencing quite strong Gen Z movements at the moment, in which a different generation is demanding citizenship in a different way. And I want to link that to social protection. Because to some extent, I think we have brought enormous progress, but one of the downsides, one of the side effects of that is that we've allowed governments and societies to avoid some difficult decisions. So can we now move to a bigger change, a change which isn't just about the technical social protection, but actually which is social and political? Yeah. So if societies have got to make decisions about how they want to protect their most vulnerable people, the people who need protection, if that's what social protection means, then there are kind of three broad areas where that can take place. Yeah. One is the state budgets. And that's not just the state budget for what they call social protection and for cash payments and old age pensions and child benefits, etc., etc., etc. It's also about how governments use their education budgets, how they use their health budgets, how they use every single budget. How is that used in a way which can advance access to services for those who need it most, protect the rights of those who need it most? So that's one area. A second area is what we could call the state non-budget. Yeah, it doesn't mean it doesn't cost money, but it's not about transferring resources. For example, a lot of that happens in the legal and policy areas. Yeah, how are people's land rights protected? Yeah. If every country had a system whereby there were child maintenance payments that women who are made pregnant by men could go and say, right, the man has to contribute towards his children. If that could happen, just think the scale of monetary transfers that would happen across the world would almost certainly dwarf all international aid put together. Labour law, how that protects people, and again, minimum wages and so on, also are a form of cash transfer, if you like, by ensuring that people get paid. So that's what I'm calling the state non-budget. And finally, there's the informal social protection, which tends not to be called social protection because we usually reserve the term for states, but we can think of it in that way. And again, that's partly about land rights, which are often protected or violated at a community level. It's about moral economies. It's about community support. And a lot of that is around gender equality, because gender equality starts there at the community, and sometimes it's reflected in national policy, but the two have there's a two-way engagement there. So if the question is what's the role of civil society, what's the role of people in all of this, then I don't think we should be reducing that to saying, well, okay, civil society or national governments have got to simply replace the missing aid resources. It's not only about that, but that of course doesn't mean that resources aren't important. It's actually the role of civil society is about active citizenship, and it's about voice. It's about engaging politically. And it means engaging politically on what the state should do. So campaigning for that, voting for that, putting pressure on governments to do that. And again, that's where gender equality has got to come from. And it's also engaging socially, because it's engaging socially on the areas which have to happen informally. So in a sense, the task, we have two tasks, I think, or rather civil society have two tasks. One is to protect those who need protected, but the other is to change the very nature of citizenship. And I think that is the most exciting challenge, if we can face it. So my last word would be this idea of decolonizing social protection. It's not actually about decolonizing social protection at all. It's about decolonizing how we as international actors think about social protection. Because if civil society engages on social protection, that always will have to come from the way in which they see it, and it can never, ever be colonial. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Simon, for a very rapid overview summary, and also, you know, fantastic responses, and particularly on that final point about decolonisation. We only have a small amount of time for discussion at this rate, but I do want to highlight to a question and a comment in the first instance for the panel. There was a question from Joe Buckley from Sightsavers about efforts to ensure disability inclusion. We can go back and find that question, but that might be to Rebecca or anyone else in the panel. I did also want to invite one of the comments that has come up in the chat, as that's kind of got a fair bit of interest from others in the session, came from, and apologies for very poor pronunciation here, but is it Zorjan Sharipov, who made some comments about the context in West Africa and Ethiopia, South Sudan, and I have put you on the spot if you're available or willing to come off mic and just give a little bit of a little bit more context behind it, if you can. Let's see if that works.
Joanna,
There
do
you
you
are.
hear me?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah. Let me just. Okay. On the Ethiopian case, basically, my assignment was in South Sudan, but we explored Ethiopia, the neighboring countries for different reasons, of course, including for social protection, for legislation on social protection, and other things. Basically, there are two large national programs there. One is shock response social protection. One is a safety net program. The small one, which was in Tigray on the conflict zone, actually was over last year, I think. Anyway, so I would like to see, I think, 2-3 things there. First of all, about the financing. The government started financing, I'm not sure the year, honestly speaking, probably like 2 years ago, 3 years ago, but I think it was a gradual, of course. And the second thing was, I think maybe it's in some countries the same. I think they use this momentum of externally funded programs to capacitate, to build some basis, capacity, some mechanisms, some setups before they start to financing. Therefore, I think, and also there was a study tour. There was 2 study tours basically from the government delegation to Ethiopia, from South Sudan, probably from other countries as well, on the region. That you see there is a ownership, not only in terms of like how to say, like enthusiasm, but it's like a practical capacity, and the driving, actually they're sitting on the driving seat. And I think that's important. And basically, but still there is their organization, like basically UN agencies, for instance, they're supporting, of course, some of the things like biometric registration, issuance of a national ID, because yeah, there is still a challenge there to the expect, I understand. That's it. I don't know whether you want me to talk about something else, but I mean, on a broad term, I can speak on the context. Yeah.
No, that's great. Thank you very much, and thank you for keeping those remarks short. I appreciate you allowing me to put you on the spot just there. The question for the panel that I also wanted to make sure that we got to was from Joe, as I say, asking about the impact of cuts on efforts to ensure social protection systems are disability inclusive. And I wondered if Rebecca or anyone else from the panel would like to take that one.
Thanks, Joe. Yeah, I was just writing a response, but yeah, I mean, thanks for the question, Joe. I think there has been progress in disability inclusion in social protection, both in terms of the sort of understanding more around the measurements of disability and how that can be incorporated into social protection programs. Sort of the 2-prong approach in terms of sort of disability-specific programs, as well as trying to mainstream disability issues more and be more responsive within existing social protection programs. I think, out of COVID, the COVID response, for example, we also saw examples of where sort of disability was more integrated in terms of data and inclusion from a targeting perspective. But I think kind of the challenges hold for other issues and sort of in relation to some of the gender equality focused issues that I mentioned, in terms of the risks being that disability inclusion focus, is sort of possibly one of the first of aspects to go, that it's, I think the importance of having data and research on the importance of disability inclusion is really important, because I think this is something which often also gets left out. And I know that there are a lot of organisations working on disability inclusion. And so the worry is as well that those kind of organisations might reduce their funding. I don't know if anybody else, either from the panel or sort of in the audience, might want to come in with some more specific examples.
Maybe just the kind of reinforcing Simon's point on the fact that social protection cuts across, and kind of that's where we also need to be sort of hinging our hopes, is that sort of, for example, we need to be focusing both on improvements in disability registration, and then making sure that disability registration data is feeding back to social protection systems, so that we can be using that kind of in a way that is actually addressing the wide spectrums of people's disabilities, rather than just zoning into at a household level, is there any disabled person? Yes, no, and if not, kind of moving on, which, as we know, many people don't self-identify as disabled, etc. So just thinking about this across the sectors, and keeping on working on those hooks that we've already made a lot of progress on. I'll just take
Yeah.
advantage to make one more comment on the going with the political grain. This is something that has come up again and again and again in the inquiry submissions that we received for the high-level panel, kind of the externally led obsession with certain types of programs being more accurate, more appropriate than others to be defeating poverty. Or, I mean, obviously they come with a lot of technical tinkering to make them kind of very perfect from some perspectives, but that often makes them less resilient from other perspectives, and that's ultimately what matters. And we really, really need to be thinking about what brings institutional resilience, and certain types of programs. The basic research has shown this kind of very clearly. They might not be ideal from some perspectives in terms of their sort of take subsidies, take school feeding programs, but they do go with the political grain, and they do have important impacts that are relevant for social protection. So in certain contexts, it might be much more important to be helping to shape these up and sort of make sure that they're working alongside a broader range of programs, rather than closing something off to create something that doesn't have the chance of flying at the first sign of crisis.
Thank you, Vale. The organisers have just let me know that they have extended the session for another 10 or 15 minutes, which means we won't abruptly be kicked off the Zoom session. If people are available to stay and ask any other burning questions or have any further discussion, you're most welcome. I do appreciate that we are at time. And for those of you who have other things, obviously, if you need to jump off, I will take this opportunity, just as you are possibly about to exit the session, to note that you'll be shown us a request to fill out a bit of an audience survey when that happens. And for those of you who've ever run a workshop, webinar, or anything where you've asked for this kind of participant feedback, please pay it forward by providing that feedback to us today. But we've got a bit of extra time. And did I see Carla? Did you have your hand up? Carla Lassard, I just saw you appear in my vision. There she is. Carla, do jump in.
Thanks.
Great to see you again.
Great to see you too. And thank you so much to Vale, Rebecca, Anna, and Simon. I mean, your analysis overview is so timely and so important for all of us. I mean, I think I have to really add is that I think that we have a real problem in terms of having not just social protection become a sector, but we have humanitarian aid and social protection be a two-track system. They don't talk to each other. They do not communicate. We are not finding ways to integrate better together. And we need to find ways to kind of debunk all of that and connect the dots better. It's not about either humanitarian assistance or national social protection systems. It's about both. And it's about actually, if you do not finance social protection systems adequately, then you will actually have increasing humanitarian needs, and you will have that going up. And it's absolutely unsustainable to have humanitarian, or to expect the humanitarian sector and humanitarian agencies to be able to step up and pay for that and be able to do anything. Also because they do not have the national understanding. They do not have that contextual experience as much as so many other civil society and state institutions do have. So I think really we need to, and we're seeing this in Palestine, right? I mean, we've just released a podcast that really talks about that, where you see a huge crisis in Palestine, probably one of the biggest ones of our times. And you still see humanitarian aid absolutely reticent to wanting to engage with the state of Palestine. And there is complete understanding and reasons for that, which are grounded on neutrality, etc., and impartiality. But we cannot use neutrality to absolutely erase what already exists. Institutions that have been created to represent people that we are trying to support. And so I think really it's about accountability as well. I mean, I have a real allergy to the idea of accountability to affected populations by humanitarian actors. There is no accountability. We have not, humanitarian actors have not been voted, elected, chosen. There's no option in that people, affected populations are choosing. They're simply lining up and receiving aid, and that's what they have. But really, there is no accountability. The true accountability is states. And if humanitarians are not reinforcing that and bypassing those systems, I think we're doing grave injustice, and we're creating a parallel and parasite, I would say, government. I mean, you see this, a groundbreaking thing that happened in Palestine, for example, through social protection, cash and voucher thematic working group, was to actually talk about data sharing. For the first time, you have UNRWA, which is a UN agency sharing data with the Palestinian Ministry of Social Development. I mean, this is decades-long agencies that have never sort of collaborated with one another. And so really seeing that coming down and it really being taboo up until now is, I think, really critical in making sure that why it's so important to make those links. I think just three more quick points. The real change, as Simon pointed out, is political. It's about rights, it's about taxation, it's about patriarchy, it's about capitalism. I mean, all of these things is what we're up against. And so I think making sure that we are protecting the civic space, protecting entitlements, and making sure that the focus is about domestic revenue, and ensuring that people can be protected across their life cycles. And then, of course, around shocks. I mean, I think, Rebecca, your brilliant, kind of overview on the care infrastructure and the resilience and the needs to kind of really be supporting that. At the end of the day, that will be what is game changing. If we focus on women, that will be game changing for poverty and for humanitarian needs. I think the third thing, I mean, Anna, to your point on decolonizing aid, I don't think we're going to decolonize aid by, focusing on sort of international donors being better at it. I think it is, as Simon says, looking at the opportunity that we should really use the opportunity that this ODA is being cut to really focus on national budgets and prioritization of national budgets to meet the needs of their populations. And I think that's the only way that things will be decolonized. We cannot expect international agencies to decolonize themselves. And I think, state, I think it's really interesting when humanitarian agencies say we stick to neutrality, when we actually really follow very closely all the demands of the political demands of governments that fund us, but we do not do the same to the states that we are supporting. And so I really think that that's what will be groundbreaking for decolonizing aid. And the last point is on what do we do now? What do we do now? I think is that we need to increasingly support governments. I think we need to use all the brilliant evidence that has come out, for example, of the basic research, of the STAAR, of so many other really, really great efforts. And it's evidence, right? This is not kind of just thoughts and opinions. So I think really we need to start looking at directly supporting governments rather than focusing too much on trying to change an international system and institution that is quite broken and quite kind of unfit for purpose at the moment. We are using tools of post-World War II to a world that is so drastically different today. And so if those systems do not change, I think we really need to start focusing on how to support the countries directly and governments and state institutions and the staff and the social protection workers that are delivering assistance and working on how to better improve support to their people. I think that's what we should be focusing on. And I hope that we're able to kind of come together as a community of practice or as consultants or whatever it is that we are to kind of be doing that more directly. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carla. And again, Carla did mention our fabulous podcast and her episode where she talks all about social protection and the intersection with the humanitarian effort in Gaza. Really timely episode, I think went live today, if not last night. So please do give that a listen into some of the points that have been raised, including some fascinating facts about taxation of the Palestinian people that I was completely unaware of, and how, we think about that in this context as well. I mean, so lots of comments and I guess, catalyzing lots of thoughts in the chat there. I do want to pick up on, Simon, your point there around kind of this intersection of social protection and humanitarianism, or at least that humanitarians are starting to understand social protection as being new. And it was really interesting to hear Anna also talk about, the kind of relevance of social protection to climate change is something that is also really a really rapid and emerging space. I did want to give Anna, given that she threw out a lot of questions there in her discussion, the burning question I would actually love to have answered was the one about, how realistic are our climate programming and shock responsive aspirations, given the realities of coverage, adequacy, and I think ultimately financing as well. But Anna, you also wanted to come back and just make a couple of points, so the floor is yours. And we do have time, so if others have questions, comments that they'd like to make, please do either drop them in the chat right now or put your hand up and we'll come to you after this.
Thanks, Jo. I mean, I think there are so many issues around climate, and I've actually put links to the USP 2030 working group on climate and social protection. If people are interested, that's a group that anyone can join, and there's lots of resources there. And also sp.org has various resources exploring different dimensions of the question. I mean, I think to me, there's just one important thing to share, I think, really one message, Jo, rather than trying to sort of answer all those questions. The key issue is that we have to look at the challenges that national governments are going to be facing, because over the next 20 or 30 years, maybe even sooner, it's clear that livelihoods are going to be profoundly disrupted. Formal labour markets are going to be disrupted. We've got both the impacts of extreme weather events, but we've got slow onset events. Salinization, land loss, glacial melt, which are really going to have profound effects. And then we've got the just transition policies themselves, carbon pricing, closure of polluting industries. This is going to change the nature of poverty. These different slow onset, rapid onset, and then the climate transition policies. And the key thing is that governments are going to be facing a changing set of issues in terms of the distribution of poverty, the nature of poverty, groups affected. And so there's going to need to be large-scale responses. And in the absence of a significant financing coming from externally, the question is, how do governments respond to that change in poverty and those poverty challenges? And so I think that is the key issue for us, looking at how we can support, we as a community can support governments to put in place the kind of large-scale programs. And I think what we've learned is that the key thing is to have basic social protection systems, which then have the flexibility to be used to respond to these different kinds of challenges as they emerge. So focusing explicitly on shock responsive is only addressing a tiny part of the issue. We really need to be thinking as a community and in collaboration with governments about what the implications are for human systems, for ecological systems, what that's going to mean for poverty, and then having large-scale responses. So I think we need to get away from pilots, from small-scale regionalized responses, looking at how governments can adapt and respond to these large-scale challenges they're going to be facing in the next 20 years. And they won't be the same challenges they faced previously, because we're looking at compounding impacts. So the structural determinants of poverty will still be there, but the situation will be changed and exacerbated by climate. So I think we need to really frame future-looking discussions of all of these issues in the context of a changing poverty environment. Thanks, Jo. There's a lot of materials out there. If people are interested, do get in touch, and I'd be happy to share with them, because I think these are really fundamental questions for us as a sector. Thank you.
Yeah, an absolutely huge and rich array of materials that have appeared throughout this conversation in the chat. And as my colleagues have been saying, these will be also shared along with the other resources from this webinar subsequently. We are closing on to 15 minutes past our original closing time. I just wanted to check if there were any other burning questions from the audience, or any other burning comments from our panel before we wrap up. Let's just put your hand up.
I just want to maybe signal the growing community of practice on informal social protection, mutual support that was born on socialprotection.org. There's also a WhatsApp chat. If anyone wants to be looking at that in more detail, maybe go and take a look. I'll try and put the link in the chat as well, and we can share it later.
I would appreciate that greatly, actually, because I have long wanted to do an episode on the Social Protection podcast on informal social protection. So if anyone else would like to hear about that, or Vali, you've got suggestions. All right, I will bring us to a close then, if my colleagues are happy with that. I want to thank again our fabulous panel, Valentina Barca, Dr. Anna McCord, Rebecca Holmes, and you for joining, and especially those of you who were able to stay a little bit past the time. As I mentioned before, there is a survey that will come up when you leave the session. Again, pay it forward, fill out the survey. It's always such useful and rich data to an organisation like ours. And I thank you all again for your time. We'll wrap it up there. Thanks, everyone.